Well, good morning and welcome to another great Pacific Research Institute webinar. I'm Tim Anaya, PRI's Vice President of Marketing and Communications, and we're thrilled to have you here for our special webinar with Jason Riley, who has just published a terrific new book called The Affirmative Action Myth. And our Lance Izumi has a lot of great questions for him, and he's ready to dive into the book with Jason. And we want your questions as well. We don't want it to just be Lance asking all the questions. We want to get your questions too. So if you're watching on Zoom today, down in the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little Q&A box. So throughout this hour, add your questions to the Q&A box. And I will come on later in the webinar and I will ask some of the great questions that I know all of our attendees will have. So, affirmative action, of course, is an issue that we here in California have battled multiple times. Most recently in 2020, when PRI and many other groups worked very hard to defeat Prop 16, which was the latest effort by those in the legislature and those in the activist world to overturn the will of the people on Prop 209. And unfortunately, it's an issue that never goes away. Those in the legislature are undeterred by the public spanking they got at the polls, and they are, they're always kind of percolating in the backgrounds with their next efforts. So Jason's book comes out at a really good time and provides a lot of great information and intellectual firepower for those of us who are trying to fight these proposals when they pop up. So, Jason is a man really who needs no introduction to those of us in the free market world. But for those who aren't familiar, he's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's been a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, publishing terrific and insightful opinion pieces for more than 20 years. And you may have read some of his several terrific books in the past. We were just talking about, really, I think one of his best was Maverick, the biography of Thomas Sowell. And as we were just saying, Lance was a student of Thomas Sowell's at UCLA back in the day. So, enough of me. We want to get this program started. So let's now, I'm going to turn it over to Lance Izumi, who's the Senior Director of PRI's Center for Education, and he's going to be interviewing Jason today. So, Lance, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Tim. Really appreciate your great introduction there, setting the stage for all of us. It's such an honor for us to have Jason Riley with us today. I've been a great admirer of Jason's works for many years, and to be able to have him on a PRI podcast is, as I say, a great honor. And it was such a joy to be able to read your new book, Jason, The Affirmative Action Myth. And so let's just, dive right in. And could you tell us why you decided to write your book, The Affirmative Action Myth, and what do you want the impact to be regarding both your thinking and the policies regarding these issues involving race?
Sure. And first, I'd just like to thank you for your interest in the book and for putting together this webinar. As you mentioned, have been writing for the Wall Street Journal for many years. I write a weekly column now, but we first connected when I was writing editorials for the newspaper for the editorial page. And given that the Wall Street Journal is this national newspaper, I was always dependent on people with their ear to the ground in different parts of the country when I was writing about a topic. And think tank scholars were people I often turned to when I was doing my reporting to get sort of the inside scoop on what was happening all over the nation. And you were one of the people I was able to reach out to way back in the late 90s and early 2000s when I was doing that work. And I just wanted to know you were one of the people that made me sound like I knew what I was talking about when I would write these editorials in the journal. So thank you again for having me here today. It's a real honor. I The reason I wrote the book was because of all the chatter I was hearing around the 2023 decision by the Supreme Court to ban racial preferences in college admissions. The outcome wasn't particularly surprising. People who followed the court looked at the makeup and they said, this policy's days are probably numbered. But there was all of this apocalyptic talk, particularly on the left, about how the ruling would impact Black Americans. It was going to devastate Black America. It was going to decimate the Black middle class, was the thinking that affirmative action had created the Black middle class, and that without racial preferences, there would be no more upward mobility in Black America. Campuses would be whitewashed, people would be shut out of jobs, and so forth, and on and on. And it was this doomsday talk that that forced me to formulate a book-length response because I thought that narrative was quite wrong in many ways. There was a Black middle class in this country well before affirmative action policies came into effect in the late 1960s and particularly in the 1970s. And moreover, it was growing at a significantly faster rate than it would grow during the era of affirmative action that we just experienced over the past 50 years or so. So I wanted to respond to that narrative and with data, with facts, with evidence, and just do a sort of compare and contrast in terms of trends we saw, incomes, college completion, home ownership rates, employment rates, and involvement with the criminal justice system, and on pre-affirmative action and then with the era of affirmative action. And that's what I attempt to lay out in the book.
Well, and that's a great segue right into my next question, Jason, is so, when you get into the specifics of your book, I thought one of the really interesting things you lead off right away by discussing life in the Black community in the first part of the 20th century. And, you write, and this is a quote from your book, the story of upward mobility amongst Black people who were only a couple of generations removed from slavery and still living under legally enforced submission has received nowhere near the amount of attention that it deserves, unquote. So, in the middle of the book, you discuss the state of Black America before affirmative action and how the golden era of for Black Americans in this country ran from after World War II to the early 1970s. So, could you elaborate a bit on this history that's actually virtually unknown now to
Yeah.
most Americans?
And one of the reasons it's not as well known is because Black leaders today, and as everyone from the Black elected officials, politicians to Black academics and media figures and activists in particular, they have no vested interest in making this history well known. I think it really undermines the narrative that they're trying to push today, which is that very little progress has been made and very little progress will be made until we vanquish racism from the land. And the era you're describing shows that the elimination of racism, which I think is frankly utopian, is not a prerequisite for Black upward mobility in this country. And in fact, tremendous Black upward mobility was taking place throughout the first two-thirds of the 20th century and in the face of all manner of adversity, discrimination, racial violence, discrimination not only legally, but by custom in many places. And so it's a great story to tell. The ways between 1940 and 1960, the Black poverty rate in this country fell from 87% to 47%. That's a 40 percentage point drop. Not only long before affirmative action policies or DEI policies, that's before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's before the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That's peak Jim Crow in this country. And yet you saw this dramatic reduction in inequality and racial inequality in this country. Whites were making gains as well, but not as fast as the Black gains. Inequality was narrowing. Um, uh, Blacks were gaining on whites educationally, income-wise. Between 1940 and 1970, the number of blacks entering middle-class professions went up by a factor of four. That is a track record that no affirmative action program has ever come close to matching. So these are some of the things I'm trying to lay out in that part of the book and talk about this pre-affirmative action era that I don't think has received the attention it deserves.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was really interesting how you talked about the that film about the women, the black women in NASA.
Yeah, Hidden Figures. Yes, and so in 1941, we're in World War One and or World War Two, I'm sorry, and FDR issues an executive order. There's a labor shortage. And he issues an executive order saying that employment in the defense industry is going to be colorblind, no more racial discrimination. And not only does that, obviously drive a lot of blacks who were already leaving the South heading north during the Great Migrations that had already started, but that intensifies. And blacks join the defense industry positions. This book, this film that you're talking about, was based on a book called Hidden Figures. And it's about these black women scientists who joined the organization that would later become NASA and helped the war effort, helped put men on the moon. And it's a remarkable story, and it was occurring again at a time when blacks faced all manner of barriers to upward mobility, and but obviously, racism. Was not going to, in and of itself, stop these efforts, and they succeeded, notwithstanding those barriers, and so, yes, that is I think, an important lesson for today.
And so, you talk about, what was going on in terms of this upward mobility,
Mhm.
but what was also very interesting, part of that is the why was this
Yes.
going on?
Yeah.
And so early in your book, you bring up I think, the really important point that involving the adoption of middle class American cultural mores
Yeah.
and habits. And you discuss not only Black Americans, but the experiences of Chinese and Japanese Americans as well. And you include some, I thought, really thought-provoking observations by Booker T. Washington and
Mhm.
W.E.B. Du Bois. But nowadays, the mere mention of these types of factors and concepts such as assimilation
Mhm.
will be viewed as, derisively in many academic quarters for sure, as acting white or respectability politics.
Yeah.
And so, could you give us your thoughts
Yeah.
about the why,
Sure.
these improvements were going on?
So just going back to the film and the book that the film is based on, what we saw going on in the 1920s and 30s and 40s in this country were blacks and the black leadership very focused on developing the human capital that is conducive to upward mobility. So we're talking about skills, work skills, habits, self-reliance, self-sufficiency, attitudes and behaviors that are all conducive to upward mobility in this country. And that was the focus. And then when the job opportunities presented themselves, as they did during World War II, blacks were ready to take advantage. When those women went to fill those jobs, no standards were lowered to put them in those jobs. If anything, they were more qualified than many of the whites who were already in those jobs. And so that sense of readiness preoccupied blacks. And part of that process was caring about, how you present yourself, how you behave, how you carry yourself. This was very, very important to an earlier generation of blacks. Today, it's derided as something called respectability politics, acting white. But what the importance understood by an earlier generation of Black leaders, and we're talking about people like not only your Booker T. Washingtons, but even more into the modern era, your Martin Luther Kings, your Thurgood Marshalls, your Roy Wilkins, people leadership of the NAACP, the people at the forefront of these civil rights efforts in the mid 20th century. It mattered a great deal to them how Blacks carried themselves, and they saw it not only as a way to advance a civil rights agenda and how you presented yourself to whites, but that these behaviors and attitudes in and of themselves were important in a free market capitalist society, so that blacks would be able to take advantage of opportunities that many of those folks would never live to see. When we did have civil rights, so if you go back and you look at one of the biggest things that stands out in the first two-thirds of the 20th century is the strength of the black family. Uh, Throughout the first half of the 20th century, black marriage rates in this country were higher than white marriage rates. Um, as late as the early 1960s, 2 out of 3 black kids were being raised in a home with a mother and a father. By the early 90s, 3 and 4 would not be. And in some of our inner cities, it would be as high as 80, 85% of kids being raised in homes without a father. That had a huge impact on upward mobility in the first two-thirds of the. Think about it just in economic terms. Obviously, it's going to be very difficult for a single-parent household to earn as much money as a two-parent household. That's going to be extremely, extremely difficult. So while in the first two-thirds of the 20th century, we saw a convergence in black-white incomes happening, that starts to stall out in the late 1960s. Why? Because you see this proliferation of single-parent homes in the black community. So that in and of itself had an impact on upward mobility, and it was obviously an impact that something like racial preferences could not compensate for, nor could an expanded welfare state compensate for these things. But these are some of the things we saw in the first two-thirds of the 20th century. Blacks were increasing their years of schooling, both in absolute terms and relative to whites. Again, the learning gap was closing. Black incomes, as I mentioned, were going up. That poverty rate was coming down. Blacks are entering these skilled professions. One other interesting statistic on the education front is I cite a scholar at Harvard, Robert Putnam, a political scientist, who put out a study a few years ago showing that there was also a convergence happening in college completion between blacks and whites. 1970 comes along, and that convergence stalls to the point where college completion rates today are right about where they were in 1970, after some 50 years of affirmative action policies in higher education. So again, we see pre-affirmative action trends, and then we see outcomes in the era of affirmative action. And I think there's just no comparison in terms of when blacks were faring better.
Yeah. And you had mentioned earlier about we had mentioned earlier about your great biography of Thomas Sowell, who actually was, as Tim mentioned and you mentioned, was a my economics professor when I was an undergraduate at UCLA. And so he was a tough grader for sure.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
he he said, and you quote him in your book, saying that if by some miracle we could go to zero racism in this
Mm.
country, he says it's by no means certain how much effect this would have on Black outcomes.
Sure.
And you then discuss the experience not only of African immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean, but also Appalachian whites. And again, you discuss the importance of marriage. So
Yeah.
could you expand on these observations?
Sure, sure. And Sol has written extensively on all of these issues, as I'm sure you know. He's made a lifetime delving into these. I cite him extensively in the book. His work, his scholarship informs so much of my journalism and so many of my other books. And so, yes, he is cited on these issues extensively in the book. And one of the points he's making that you mentioned is sort of dovetailing on an observation that W.B. Du Bois made um, more than 100 years ago in a book published in the late 1890s, I believe, right around 1900, uh, called The Philadelphia Negro. And what Du Bois says in that book, and so you have to, we're going back more than 125 years. What Du Bois says in that book is that if white people lose their prejudices overnight, again, this is the 1890s, just a generation out of slavery. Says if white people lose their prejudices overnight, he says it might help a few blacks here and there, but it wouldn't help the majority of black people in this country economically if that were to happen, because their problems are not based on that. They're not based on on how they're being treated by whites. Their problems are based on that lack of development of human capital that we were discussing earlier. Now, if Du Bois can make that observation, one generation out of slavery, imagine how much more so that is the case today. And Sol looks at census data and says he says that and a lot of people don't know this, but uh, the poorest county in the United States in many years in census data is in regions of Appalachia. A county in Kentucky, in particular, has been number one a number of years. It's a rural county in Kentucky, and it's 99% white, Lance. There's no racism in this county. And what Sol says is um, in this county, median household incomes are less than half of the white median nationwide. But they're also thousands of dollars less than the black median nationwide. Um, and he says that doesn't mean, racism doesn't exist, but it does undermine this argument that racial discrimination is what is driving racial disparities economically in this country. There's also other data. More than 9 million Americans in the 2020 census earn above the white median. I mean, there are millions of blacks doing this. We hear this talk of white supremacy all the time being the main problem. And what did Ta-Nehisi Coates said? He said, there are no problems facing Black America that can't be solved by ending white supremacy. I mean, that's a remarkable statement that he's making. But I'd also point out, as Sol does, according to the 2020 census, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, Indian Americans, all out earn whites. Again, where's this white supremacy argument coming from? The other point, and this gets to where culture can be playing a much bigger factor than racial discrimination when it comes to disparities. If you look at the poverty rate among married black couples in this country, it's been in the single digits for roughly the past 4 decades. In fact, in some years, the black poverty rate among married couples is not only lower than it is among blacks as a whole in this country, it's lower than the poverty rate among whites as a whole in this country. Obviously, racists are not giving a pass to black people who are married. So again, that shows you that family formation could have a lot more to do with income inequality than racism, but it's not something that the left likes to talk about. Just a quick story here. I'm not sure if I cite this in my book, but I know I've written about it. There's an economist, a woman named Melissa Carney, who put out a book a couple of years ago called The Two-Parent Privilege. And all it is sort of chronicling all the data we have showing the kinds of advantages that children have when they grow up in homes with a mother and a father. Advantages over people who come from from homes that only have one parent. She tells the story in her book of how in her circle, in her intellectual circles, colleagues, this is a MIT trained economist, colleagues were saying, you should not publish books on this topic. They were saying, you know, and she goes on to explain why they were thinking that way. She says it's because on the left, when we discuss income inequality, well, we cannot discuss the role that family formation plays in driving that. That is taboo. We cannot go there. And that's where I was going with my data. So to this day, it remains taboo to discuss the role that family formation plays in economic outcomes. And yet it explains so much. The data is so clear on this front.
Yeah. When I was reading your portion on the Asians, uh, I in my grandfather, was in an internment camp during World War II. So I'm his grandson, a couple generations removed from that,
Yeah.
and so I always think when I hear people, the pro race preference folks say that, well, Asians are white adjacent,
Yes.
for
Yes.
example, that I
And
always
Jews too. Yeah.
yeah, and Jews too.
Yeah.
But I always say that, well, I guess really the only whites my grandfather was adjacent to were the guards in the camp.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's so true that this argument that racism or racial discrimination, past racial discrimination can be used as this blanket explanation for disparities today. It just does not hold up to scrutiny. Obviously, Japanese Americans were interned. Chinese Americans were lynched. In California, in parts of California, they were not allowed to own land or work in certain professions. Um, Everyone knows the history of Jewish discrimination. And yet, these are groups, Asians as a group, outperform whites, both academically and economically, and have for decades. So it just does not hold up. And it's not only true here in the U.S., it can be shown internationally. The ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia, Indians in East Africa, the Lebanese in West Africa, and on and on and on. These are examples of ethnic and racial minority groups outperforming the majority, either economically or academically or both, despite being discriminated against in the past or even in the present. Yes, that argument just does not hold up.
Yeah. I want to, let our viewers know that if they have questions for Jason, that they should type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So, my colleague Tim and I is going to read some of those questions at the end of this webinar to hopefully get your interaction with Jason. So, please feel free to type in those questions for Jason in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So, Jason, let's move on then to, you detail in your book, you make this really important point that efforts to ensure non-discrimination based on race and colorblind equality before the law, which culminates in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that, despite assurances from the Act supporters, you've had bureaucratic and judicial activists who have turned this equal treatment and opportunity concept, which the public supports and supported and supports, into a racial balancing scheme and equity of results. Could you tell us about this distinction and this transformation?
Sure. Um, One of the things I lay out very early in the book is how I'm using the term affirmative action, because it is a term that different people can use different ways, and it can result in you talking past one another. And so to avoid that, I'm very clear in defining affirmative action as the term is used in the book. So affirmative action begins as an effort to reach out to groups that have been overlooked in the past and include them and employment and on college campuses and bring those groups up to existing standards. What it became in later decades was an effort to lower standards for those groups and put in place double standards based on race and ethnicity. The first type of affirmative action was widely popular and has generally been popular in this country and remains popular. But that is not what is practiced today. What is practiced today is racial quotas, racial set-asides, lowering standards, racial favor. That is affirmative action today, and that is how I am using the term. And what's interesting is that when you go back to the debates, and not just the debates over the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, you can go back to Brown versus Board of Education. It was very clear what the court was saying in that ruling, what it meant by desegregation. And it was not forced integration. It said schools should accept students without regard to race. Very clear about that. You fast forward to 64 and 65, the debates over in Congress, the legislative debates over the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. Again, very clear in the language. This is not about this is about hiring people without regard to race. This is about admitting kids on college campuses without regard to race. And yet you get uh, what we call today the administrative state taking over from there, twisting this language to, in many cases, mean the exact opposite of the letter of the law that was written. And then you get courts blessing this verbal jujitsu, and that leads you to the era of affirmative action. That leads you to busing for racial balance. That leads you to quotas and to set-asides and to racial balancing in outcomes, when that was never intended by the people who wrote these laws, by the Congresses that passed these laws, and so forth. And that's, what I think the court in 2023 was trying to put an end to go back and just understand and acknowledge and enforce what these laws actually say.
Yeah, kind of the most recent, at least in the public's mind, incarnation of this current interpretation of what affirmative action means is like critical race theory. And so, because we've heard a lot about CRT over the last several years, and you discuss Ibram Kendi and others who push critical race theory, which is really racial Marxism.
Yeah.
And you make the great observation that the goal of CRT is not to abolish racist policies, but rather to change it as to who's on the receiving end.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And so, could you elaborate on this for us?
Yeah. Sol had a nice line about this some years back when he'd be asked about affirmative action, the people who support it. He says, the left doesn't want to end racism. They just want to put it under new management. And that is in effect what the Kendys and the Coates and the Nicole Hannah Joneses of the 1619 Project. This is about changing who's on the receiving end of racial discrimination. It is not about ending racial discrimination, and that's quite obvious. When I mentioned earlier that one of the impetus for the book was the chatter around the 2023 decision. A lot of that apocalyptic talk was coming from Black elites. It's coming from Barack Obama and Michelle Obama. It was coming from Black college professors. It was coming from Blacks, cable news hosts, and so forth. Um, and the reason is because those are the Blacks who have tended to benefit from affirmative action policies, Black elites. Affirmative action is sold in the name of helping the Black underclass, lifting them out of poverty and into the middle class. But in practice, it has tended to help well-off Blacks become even better off. So there's a reason your Kendys and your Coateses and your Obamas are out there denouncing these policies. That is the class of Blacks that has tended to benefit the most from them. And just to put some numbers on that phenomenon, if you go back to the late 1960s and look at the top earning Blacks, uh, top 20%, uh, their share of income grew over the next 25, 30 years, well into the early 90s, at about the same rate that the white top 20% of income grew. But the bottom black 20% saw their share of income fall at more than double the rate of poor whites.
Mhm.
You can look at it also in employment over the same period. In the late 1960s, something like 80% of the least educated blacks had jobs, were employed. If you go forward 30 years, it's down to less than 50% of the least educated blacks having jobs after 30 years of affirmative action. So again, these policies have tended to help well-off blacks, and that's why they are the chief defenders. Critical race theory comes out of legal studies popularized by academics like Derek Bell back in the 70s and 80s. And Bell basically wants critical race theory used, it's a theory to support affirmative action policies. He wants race used as a credential in hiring in academia, as an academic credential in hiring
Mhm.
in academia. And it's pretty upfront about that. So I see I see critical race theory as a fancy argument for affirmative action, and
Mhm.
and I think that its defenders have a vested interest in keeping these policies in place.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if whites can never get away from their inherent racism, well,
Mhm.
then the whole industry that's grown up around, let's say, all these professional development training sessions, that will supposedly indoctrinate, teachers and other employees about race issues,
Mhm.
run by CRT
Yeah.
proponents
Yeah.
will disappear if somehow you get rid of this view of whites as inherently racist.
You're absolutely right, and there's another point to make here too about these black elites who defend affirmative action policies. Um, they do not represent the views of most black people when it comes to affirmative action. Polls have consistently shown that most blacks oppose racial preferences. It's the black elites who support them. And it's industries like mine, the media, who continue to turn to those black elites to speak for quote unquote Black America. And not only, as you know, not only on issues of education or not only on issues of racial preferences, on school choice. The majority of blacks support this. The elites do not. Voter ID laws are supported by a majority of blacks, but
Mhm.
not by black elites. On and on and on. You can go policy after policy. So we have to be very careful about allowing a minority of blacks, of upper income blacks, to pretend that they are speaking on behalf of all blacks, when in fact they're really speaking on behalf of themselves.
Yeah. I mean, one of the big issues that you talk about in your book, and devote a whole chapter to it, and we in California are dealing with this. Our legislature is spending a lot of time debating the issue of reparations to
Yes,
Black Americans.
yes, yes.
So, in your book, you say that like DEI schemes, reparations for slavery is another means of offering preferential treatment based on racial heritage. So, could you expand on this observation and give us your thoughts about both the movement and the arguments for reparations?
Well, it is a little absurd coming out of California to begin with. I mean, it's not the only state doing this, but that California is doing it sort of heightens the absurdity here. Obviously, California is never a slave state. Um, and the state just reiterated that it doesn't want racial preferences in 2020 after initially saying it didn't want them back in the mid 1990s. And I know we can talk about that a little later. But I think it was something like 1940 before even 2% of California's population was black. So not only was California not a slave state, not a lot of black people. Even today, the Asian population, the Latino population far surpasses the black population in California. So it's an extreme example of asking people who aren't even descendants of slave owners to pay reparations to people who were never slaves. It's going to be a very hard thing to sell, I think. But one of the other problems with reparations generally, though, is I think they amount to another huge wealth redistribution scheme. At the end of the day, that's all we're really talking about. And we've tried that in this country before. If we could address inequality and solve poverty by the government sending out checks to people, we would have solved this a long time ago because government's pretty good at doing that, sending checks to people. But I have no faith that yet another huge wealth redistribution scheme like reparations will be any more effective than the previous ones that we've tried. And that's, I think, one of the other problems with the reparations argument. Another thing they do, and I'll just add this, is I'll make one more point about California, and this relates to that. Um, California's had this small black population for a long time, but the blacks that have gone to California have tended to do pretty well among blacks in this country. In other words, I believe back as early as like the 1940s, 30s and 40s, um, California had the highest black home ownership rate in the country. In the mid 1960s, the National Urban League put out a survey that said Los Angeles was the best city, large city in the country for blacks to move to in terms of home ownership, jobs, and income. This is the state that wants to lead the effort on reparations. It's quite remarkable. But and this gets me to one of the other flawed arguments about reparations, and Coates's argument in particular, Ta-Nehisi Coates's argument relies on this data point, and that is redlining. That the reason we have these disparities today is due to discriminatory housing policies. Two problems with that argument, two major problems with that argument. One is that um, while blacks were in fact um, overrepresented in districts that were redlined, in areas that were redlined, and where lenders wouldn't loan, the majority of people who lived in redlined areas in this country during redlining were white. So if the basis for receiving reparations is being a victim of redlining, reparations will have to go to a lot of white people.
Right, right.
But this other point to make on the redlining is that despite redlining, black home ownership rates during the redlining era increased at a faster rate than white home ownership rates. So redlining was wrong. It's over. But to say based on that policy, blacks are entitled to reparations today, I think is extremely misguided on both those fronts.
Let
And
me
of
say
course, the
before.
other little thing that proponents of reparations don't like to discuss is, as we have unveiled in PRI's research on this, if you're going to pay what the Reparations Commission laid out, which is estimated to cost about $1.4 million per person, that's a $2.8 trillion bill, you
Yeah,
know?
just impractical. It's impractical all
Just,
around.
just,
Immoral and impractical. Yes.
that's right.
Before I
No
turn it
problem.
over to Tim, for questions from our audience, and I encourage everybody who has a question still to submit that to the Q&A box. Let me just ask you really quickly, Jason. After having written this book and given the changed political situation that we've seen this year in 2025 versus 2024, even, where do you see the future of race-based affirmative action going in the near and longer term?
I don't think the proponents are going to give up. And historically, they have not given up. And I go back to the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling. Excuse me. It's not as if the Southern segregationists after that ruling said, "Well, we tried," and decided to desegregate. No, they fought. They fought and fought and fought for decades. We needed follow-up lawsuits. We needed judicial orders to enforce the Brown ruling. This went on for decades. And I don't think that today's DEI advocates and racial preference advocates are going to give up either. And what they have in common with those Southern segregationists, the progressives today, just as the Southern segregationists resisted colorblind policies, Lance, progressives today have turned colorblind into a dirty word, and they are going to resist colorblind policies just the way those Southern segregationists did. So I think it will take more litigation, follow-up lawsuits, watchdog organizations keeping an eye, making sure that colleges are complying with this ruling, that corporate America is complying, that K through 12 is complying. There are end runs around this. People who want to get rid of test schools at the K through 12 level, people who want to get rid of gifted programs, people who want to get rid of honors classes. These are all efforts to get around bans on racial preferences, overt bans on racial preferences, to get the right racial mix, racial balance at the end of the day. And so I think that opponents of these policies will have to stay on the case because I don't think the other side will be giving up anytime soon.
And in fact, I think Palo Alto, I believe I just read that Palo Alto may have gotten rid of their honors and gifted programs. So
Yeah.
anyway, so with that, first of all, I want to thank you for your great answers to these questions that I provided. But I know that Tim has some questions that some of our audience have sent in. So Tim,
Sure.
why don't you have some time to ask Jason those questions?
We have some really great questions from our audience members, and if you have a question, remember to submit it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. First question we have up is from Matt, and he asks, can efforts to stamp out race discrimination in colleges, for example, succeed when those institutions are staffed completely by affirmative action true believers?
Well, I mean, it makes it more difficult, but the people in charge are obliged to do this. I mean, or they have to restaff those positions. I mean, if the people in those positions refuse to abide by the law, they should be fired and can be fired, I would assume, for breaking the law. So it really comes down to whether these policies will be enforced. And I think the questioner is right that given how committed a lot of administrators and faculty are on our college campuses to these policies, they will be difficult to stamp out. I agree, and that's why I think this isn't over yet. But these schools are obliged to do these things. We're looking at all this unrest on campus with regard to what's going on in the Middle East, and these schools have been trying to throw up their hands, but they're obliged to protect the civil rights of their Jewish students. They can't duck that, and lawsuits can be brought. And we currently have a federal government, an administration that seems intent on enforcing the Supreme Court ruling. Now, obviously, the Trump administration won't be there forever, and I frankly think a lot of the people the questioner is describing are trying to just wait out the Trump administration. This is, in other words, what we're seeing is more of a strategic withdrawal, not surrender. And they think that they can just sort of wait out the administration, then go back to the way things were. We'll see. But right now, we do have an administration that seems intent on enforcing students for fair admission to be Harvard, and I think that's a good thing.
And using money for it.
Yes, yes, using their leverage, using their leverage.
That's right. So here's a question from Megan, and I think it's a question that probably a lot of people have in the back of their minds in our cancel culture era. And she says, she's a white woman who wants to participate in these debates and conversations thoughtfully, but she's aware of the risk in our cancel culture era of sounding insensitive or worse. So, What advice do you have for her to help someone like her address the topic responsibly and participate in the debates and the discussion um, in our era of cancel culture and, you know, also wanting to take into account, everyone's experiences in this issue?
Well, I don't think other people should be feel obligated to stick their necks out in this regard, particularly if it can um, have consequences in terms of uh, career advancement or your reputation and or being deplatformed or that sort of thing. I don't see any need to go out of your way to engage, and particularly with people who aren't interested in facts and data and reasoning and logic. There's really it's really kind of a waste of time trying to engage. Now, if you do come across someone who is interested in the facts, and that's what I try and lay out in the book, whether these policies are have harmed or helped people in the past, and maybe there are people out there. I mean, I wrote a book about it, so I'm hoping there are people out there open to having a reasoned debate about these issues, and I cite my sources, and people can go double check them and determine whether they think I'm cherry picking or what have you, or taking things out of context. But that's what reasonable people can do. And unfortunately, too many people engaged in these debates today aren't reasonable, and they're not worth engaging with, in my view.
And that's, of course, what Lance is here for, to stick his neck out and take all the slings and arrows.
Well, I think stick my neck out. Jason and I, we have hard helmets despite the fact we go to the same barber.
Well, yeah, but isn't it interesting, Lance, what is considered sticking your neck out today? I mean, if you disagree, if I say no, math is not racist, Lance, that is sticking your neck out
Mhm.
today. If I say punctuality is not white supremacy, that's ridiculous. That's sticking your neck out.
Mhm.
If I say the person who swam on the men's team last year should not be allowed to swim on the women's team this year. That's sticking your neck out.
Mhm.
Making commonsensical statements
Right.
is considered sticking your neck out today. It's ridiculous.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. I mean, especially, I mean, when you think about like if you were to say these things 30 years ago, right? People would think you're insane.
Mm, right.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting question, and Lance may have some thoughts on this one too. Affirmative action, as we see and think of the debates, is typically considered a black-white issue. But how do you see the issue in a more multi-ethnic America grappling with this debate?
Well, I was very um, uh, pleased with the approach that the plaintiffs took in in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. The plaintiffs were Asian, and I thought it was a very effective strategy because affirmative action in college admissions is really asking. What they presented with is this question: why should Asians be discriminated today against today for what whites did to blacks in the past? And that's what affirmative action was doing. And you go, wait a minute, does that make a lot of sense? And so I the other thing that I've sort of been encouraged by is the sort of there's been a little more political activism. I don't know if Lance shares this observation in the Asian American community. I've seen it here in New York, where I'm based, when it comes to efforts to tamp down standards at the test schools, where Asians are very much overrepresented. We have about eight in New York City where kids take a test to be admitted, a single test, and more than half of the slots at these schools go to Asian kids, even though Asians are only, I don't know, 14, 15, 16% of the student population in New York. So these parents have been very, very active in pushing back against efforts to water down those standards. We saw it with some school board elections in San Francisco and other places. We saw it with the proposition in 2020 the effort to roll back race-based the ban on race-based admissions. I think Asian Americans in California led the fight
That's
against doing that. And so I'm very encouraged by that development.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, Jason. Actually, interesting enough, several years ago, our mutual friend Gail Harriott from the University of San Diego Law School actually edited a book on race preferences, and my PRI colleague Rowena Itchan, who is our Chief Operations Officer, and I actually co-authored a chapter for that book on the impact of race preferences on Asian Americans. And of course, we
Mhm.
talked a lot about the Harvard case, which was at
Yeah,
that time still going through the courts.
yeah,
And I think that and you brought this out in your book, about a lot of the statistics that show, how much more Asians have to, for example, perform on
right.
standardized tests in order to get into the elite colleges and that sort of thing. And these issues involving the elimination of honors and advanced programs,
Mhm.
are oftentimes disproportionately taken, by Asian Americans. And
Yeah,
so, therefore,
yeah,
these issues involving so-called equity are the
yeah.
ones that actually cut Asian Americans, and so,
Oh yeah, yeah. And we saw what I mean, one of the best parts of this lawsuit in 2023, Lance, for me, was the discovery
Mhm,
phase where we got to look behind the curtain of what these schools were doing. And it was really, really egregious behavior when it came to how they were treating Asian American applicants.
mhm,
These personality tests and weighting their responses and this holistic review nonsense they claimed they were engaging in, it was all revealed to be a complete fraud. They were lying and they got caught. And we also knew from the experience back in the mid 90s around Prop 209, they claimed that they were not discriminating against Asians back then. They claimed there was no ceiling on Asian enrollment at UCLA and Berkeley. But what happened right after Prop 209 passed? Asian enrollment spikes at the most selective colleges in the University of California system. Oh my, how could that be? Once they could not take race into account, that's what happened. And so these schools have been lying for so long about this stuff, which leads them to believe, A, they're not going to give up on it easily, as we've been discussing, and B, that people need to stay on the case who want to stamp this stuff out. You know.
yeah, because like, when these efforts are directed at so-called white privilege,
Yeah.
Asians are the collateral damage.
They are, and the other thing, and because when you talked about the argument that Asians are white adjacent, and that's how the left describes why they can be discriminated against. But one interesting point I always make or like to make in these discussions, because a lot of people say racially disparate outcomes are based on poverty and income. And that's what we need to do is tackle poverty, and then these disparities would go away. I always remind them that even low-income Asians students are outperforming low-income students from other racial, or not only low-income students from other racial and ethnic groups, middle and upper income students from other racial and ethnic groups. Those selective schools in New York, um, many of the Asian students who attend them come from very low-income neighborhoods in the outer boroughs. Most of the blacks and whites at those schools are middle and upper income. So it's not just about a power, it's about a culture. It's about a culture of learning, prioritizing education, extra money going to test prep instead of expensive clothes and jewelry. And it's a cultural issue. And that is what is lacking in a lot of all of these groups, that prioritization of the importance of education and learning. And that's, and of course, with the cultures also, I think the group with the lowest rate of single parent homes are also Asians in this country, which probably does not play a small part in what they're able to do academically and economically in our society.
Well, with that point, we've run out of time in our hour. So we want to thank very much Jason Riley for the generosity of his time today at our webinar. And we can't recommend it highly enough. Run, don't walk to your bookstore or your favorite online bookseller and pick up a copy of the Affirmative Action Myth today. So, Jason, thank you again for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank
Thanks
you.
very much, Jason.
And to all of our listeners today, we want to thank you for tuning in. Make sure you follow pacificresearch.org/events closely and check out all of our upcoming webinars and events. We have our inaugural Milton Friedman dinner in New York City coming up at the end of June, and we're going to honor. It's actually going to be a really terrific evening for those of you who are able to get to New York that night. But we're going to honor Mark Cunningham, the editorial page editor of the New York Post, and we'll have Larry Kudlow and Betsy McCoy and Bill McGurn there as well. It's a roast and toast, we're calling it. And then also stay tuned for our event in October. We're doing a sailing in honor of William F. Buckley's 100th birthday. So check out those events and more at pacificresearch.org/events. And